I don't know if I should answer today's question, but I'm going to give it a go. Because it's a question about something that's so embarrassingly trivial as an issue. The question isn't trivial, but the issue is trivial, that we probably shouldn't speak about it. But I am going to answer it, and the good bit of the answer could be that it illuminates for you how these hybrid amorphous authoritarian regimes work, particularly how Russia worked as that kind of regime before it took the totalitarian turn that it took after the beginning of the war. But because we're going to be talking about something relatively trivial, something that's exploded on the Russian internet today, but it's not being discussed much in the English-speaking world, and it's to do with something that the team of Alexei Navalny, Russia's main opposition leader, did. But before we get to that, let's give ourselves some serious context about what's happening, and then contrast the triviality we'll engage with to the serious stuff that we actually should be looking at. And the serious stuff is that Russia is bombing Ukrainian civilian infrastructure, and that means that we've got to take very seriously the thought that Russia can't win, but it's not automatic that Ukraine is going to win. Whether Ukraine wins is about what we do and how we support Ukraine, how we feel, both about those Ukrainians who have ended up on occupied territory and those Ukrainians who are in the majority of Ukraine's territory under Ukrainian control, but are on the wrong end of aerial bombardment. What are we going to do to help them? How do we feel about what's going on in the sense of ongoingly reevaluating what we need to do to make Ukraine win, which is the strategy we recommend, I recommend, because it serves the security interests of Western countries. And what does that mean in practical terms about getting Ukraine more help? And that's an individual question that each country is trying to resolve on its own. But we've got to keep coming back to this idea that we can't just complacently assume that Ukraine's going to win. It's about the kind of commitment and the kind of support that we show. Anyway, serious stuff, much more trivial stuff. Alexei Navalny's team, who now are not operating under his control in any way. He barely knows what they're doing because he's cut off from them. He's in jail with very limited communication. But they have put on their sanctionable list somebody who most people of sensibility feel shouldn't be there. And their list is really a list of folks who they recommend to the European Union to consider sanctioning. Because these people are corrupt or because they are inciting the war. And they're not saying that Venediktov is corrupt or inciting the war. They're rather saying that he is on there for a very special reason, which might be one of the reasons that they've put him on there. And the reason is that he engaged in a particular kind of accommodation with the regime which they find egregious and unacceptable. So let's get into this in a way that will illuminate for us how these kind of regimes work. First of all, you probably know who Alexei Navalny is, and you probably know that he has a team of folks who are now outside of Russia who are doing media and potentially political oppositional activity. Now, who is Alexei Venediktov? Alexei Venediktov is the editor-in-chief, or the ex-editor-in-chief of Echo Moscow, a radio station where you could speak freely, that got shut when Russia took the partial totalitarian turn it took after the beginning of the war. Now you might say, why wasn't it shut earlier? If it was a place where hour after hour, you could find people calling Putin illegitimate, calling Putin's wars monsters, calling Putin a monster, and so on. Why wasn't it shut? And there are several reasons here, not in any order of priority. Venediktov knew Putin personally before Putin was president. not closely, but they were acquainted and they had a history of interaction. The station wasn't oppositional in its editorial policy. It tried to do impartial journalism by giving all voices a platform, which is quite an extraordinary thing, almost an undoable thing to even aspire for. Because how do you do that in an illegitimate regime? Do you invite the regime to send representatives to defend the regime's position? Or do you not? If you don't, that looks wrong. If you do, that looks wrong. It's not like you're inviting a representative of a political party you despise in the West to give their perspective, because they're going to be legitimate, tendentiously at least. How do you handle this? Well, Echo Moscow tended to handle this by giving the government side a voice, giving the government side a possibility of return and returning with their perspective and their arguments. Another reason why it survived, not the most important reason, is that autocratic regimes develop information poverty. In other words, because all Kremlin journalism is theater, Kremlin journalists aren't real journalists, and they therefore can't gather any information about anything going on in the world. So what happens is that this sort of sliver of independent journalistic space can sometimes allow an authoritarian regime to find out some things about what's really going on in the world. And on a few occasions, Kremlin was grateful to be corrected by Echo Moscow, and it simply had no idea what was going on in the world, including in Ukraine. Another reason is that having this very small bastion of free speech allowed the Kremlin to say, come on, we do have free speech, come on, we do have criticism of the regime. And it also allowed them to create a kind of pasture for oppositional folks in Moscow and Petersburg. Knowing that pasture was delimited, that only a couple of million people were ever going to listen. It was never going to be a significant audience, therefore it was never going to threaten the regime. And so these folks could pasture there, and this could be stably retained. And when the totalitarian turn happened and the last few bits of independent media in Russia got erased, these Moscow and Petersburg folks interpreted this not just as a kind of asphyxiation of free speech in the country. They interpreted it as a personal message to them, saying, you're no longer welcome in Russia anymore. This country is now at war with you too. Because now there is no space. There's no public space in which we're going to allow you to speak. And despite all of these reasons to keep Echo Moscow, keeping it going was still about endless phone calls, battles, different kinds of wriggling, pressure, and there was always the possibility any day that it could be shut. It's also a strange situation because the station is mostly owned by the regime, by Gazprom, but not sufficiently owned by Gazprom for them to control editorial policy. So it's such an incredibly nuanced balance and a weird situation where the government mostly owns a bit of media that is constantly piling criticism, vehement and visceral criticism at it. But partly through Venediktov's capacity to fight and improvise, and also sometimes make limited compromises to keep that space going. Partly because of that, a station could exist. Now, why was Venediktov so good at keeping the station open? And why did he make the compromises that he had to sometimes make to keep it open? Partly because he is extremely stubborn and vainly committed to playing a kind of heroic role of keeping this thing going against the odds. But partly because he also felt a vain satisfaction around having a kind of power. Because the regime saw him as being very influential. They saw him as somebody who was the main person overlooking that space where all of the anti-regime Russians pastured. And they felt that, that's a space that could become a great threat to them at any point, and then they needed to be quite careful how they negotiated with it. And so he saw himself as an independent journalist who had to battle and sometimes prostitute himself and, over-accommodate some requests from the regime, some relationships with the regime. But they saw him as partly being a kind of inadvertent regime functionary who basically fulfilled the regime's need to keep on somehow managing and balancing that sort of space. It's a very unusual situation and a very precarious situation. And ongoingly, it always looked like the balance of advantage tilted towards shutting Echo for the regime. But they kept it open because, in part because Venediktov had such excellent relationships that he could just about pull enough strings and keep it going. And one of his worst compromises was starting his evangelism for this business of electronic voting that, in my view, turned out to be a disaster. Venediktov still doesn't concede that, but it turned out to be a disaster and just another way for the regime to basically fake votes. There is some debate about the facts here, and so I don't want you to just take my view here, but I'm just declaring my view, as it were, so that you're clear where I stand. So I think this was an unfortunate move from him, and in the bird's eye sort of perspective, I would describe that move as him being in the process of sort of endless partial compromise with the regime, negotiation with the regime, but then suddenly giving away too much with this, and becoming an evangelist for a bit of electoral technology that probably just worked in the regime's favor. But did it change anything significantly? I mean, not really. It's a country with fake elections and pretty fake institutions, pretty fake procedures. So whatever it changed, it wasn't revolutionary, And a lot of people have come back after they've discovered Venediktov on this list, and have criticized Navalny's team for something they did. And what they did was what was called smart voting, which is that you go and you vote for somebody who will be a sort of a fake opponent of the regime, so somebody who's just a kind of a decorative candidate, but you nevertheless vote for them because of the several candidates that are running, this might be the least convenient one for the regime to have elected. So you weren't ever going to elect anybody oppositional that way, but you were going to elect somebody who was inconvenient for the regime. And what's happened is that the majority of these people who Navalny's team helped elect have turned out now to support the war. And I actually don't think that that's a criticism of Navalny's team at all, because there's a simple disanalogy here. They were trying a strategy of regime destabilization. It may have worked, maybe it didn't work, but that's all they were doing. So its efficacy has no ethical consequence for them, really, in my view. But Venediktov's indulgence of this electronic voting story does have ethical consequences. But now let's put this all together. Here is a man who is basically heroically and against the odds keeping one of the most extraordinary free speech platforms in the world going against all the odds. He is taking a lot of crap for it. He's making some kind of compromises. But in exchange for that, he's creating a platform where hundreds of people speak without any compromise. They just speak their minds completely, and they're allowed to, which is extraordinary. So basically, you're looking at somebody who is not just sustained a very important institution for many years in Russia, but has himself become a sort of institution, and he's a flawed man. He is a man who's probably done lots of dumb stuff. But in the big picture perspective, he's going to be remembered as somebody who's almost at one with the idea of free speech under Putin's authoritarian regime. So it's an extraordinary and historical achievement. And he got lots of things wrong, I'm sure, and Navalny's team are kind of right to point to this electronic voting business as being perhaps the most glaring example. But so what? How does that possibly make him eligible for the sanctionable list? And how does it possibly make sense to put a man on that list who keeps going around the Western world, meets politicians, meets diplomats with an anti-war message, which basically says that Russia is killing Ukrainians and it must stop immediately, and this war isn't just a catastrophe for Ukraine, but it's utter suicide for Russia's future. Yeah, he's a man who's going around with that message. He's a man who is also highly respected in journalistic and in diplomatic circles across the Western world. He's interviewed many Western world leaders. His reputation in many people's eyes weighs much more than the reputation of Navalny's team. It's politically stunningly counterproductive for them. And this is the most important thing. Navalny's team is outside of Russia. Venediktov is in Russia. And in Russia, Venediktov is saying, immediately get rid of all Russian troops in Ukraine, stop killing Ukrainians right now, and know that with this war, this president has basically ended Russia's future for the next generation of Russians. This is a man in Russia who's saying that like 7 times a day. And there are safety issues here too. It's hard to put Venediktov in prison for the regime, but it's possible. They've declared him a foreign agent, of course, and they've closed his station. But that doesn't seem to trouble Navalny's children. So it's going to be hard to put Venediktov in prison because the machinery will be skeptical and concerned about doing that without Putin's explicit agreement, because Putin has known Venediktov from, when Putin was rising high in politics but wasn't president yet. So they're going to have a problem putting him in jail. I mean, they easily could. They could do anything. But they have a problem putting him in jail without Putin's agreement. And Putin feels he'd rather not put him in jail unless he absolutely can't avoid it. So there's a modicum of safety there that Venediktov has, but it's not completely safe. I mean, he's had, for his anti-war positions, axes put through his door, his apartment door. So, flawed person who did a big screw up and did an accommodation with the regime, but in the big picture, please, come on. And here is what's also really important. When the Crimea annexation happened, Alexei Navalny, who, by the way, himself would never put Venediktov on that list. So that's the extraordinary thing. Navalny doesn't know about this, and he himself wouldn't have put Venediktov on this list, and he's known Venediktov personally for a long, long time. But when the Crimea annexation happened, Navalny immediately came out and said, this is completely illegal and completely unacceptable. But, and I'm going to be siding roughly with the idea that we shouldn't judge Navalny too harshly for this. Then Navalny said, well, it doesn't mean I'm going to give Crimea back. And there was a very famous exchange between Venediktov and Navalny, which a lot of folks on Navalny's team didn't like, because Venediktov is the best person in Russia at asking tough questions. And so he asked Navalny, would you give Crimea back straight away? And Navalny said, no, it's not a sandwich. You can't just give it back. And that's the famous line that everybody remembers. I tend to de-emphasize that line and emphasize Navalny's formal position that the annexation is illegal and unacceptable. And he came out with that immediately and was clear about that all the way through. But beyond that, he said, look, we can't just give it back. It's not a sandwich. And this will be a problem for decades upon decades between Russia and Ukraine. It shouldn't have been done. But now that it has been done, the best way forward, he said, is probably some kind of referendum on that territory that I, as president, would organize. And depending on the results of that referendum, we'd make sure we've got international observers, that it was free and fair. Depending on that, we could then take things forward and give Crimea back or not. So this is obviously the sick logic of Navalny's team applied here, but why can't we then say that Navalny is sort of inciting the war? Obviously, that's the most ridiculous thing to say in the world. He is in prison and he's out there being tortured. And when he is allowed to make court statements, he immediately does a vehement anti-war message. It would be the most stupid thing in the world. But if we took that out of the context of Navalny's career and agency, we could then say, well, hang on, this is somebody who was sort of equivocal about stage one of Putin's invasion of Ukraine, which was 2014. So surely we should put everybody who works for Navalny on the sanctions list and send them back to Russia, where they'll go to jail immediately. So the politics of toxic self-elevation into the shape of being some kind of tribunal when it's not appropriate is something that's really important to avoid. Western countries are struggling with that terribly at the moment. I'm going to talk about that. But it's really important to avoid, because then we start asking serious questions about Navalny's team and what they're up to and whether they're being serious or not, you know. We don't need to ask these questions. We could just support them. But now that they've put this on the table, I can ask serious questions. What exactly are you, Navalny's team? I mean, you're a YouTube channel, okay. Several YouTube channels, okay. But, like, what are you beyond that? What are you doing? Like, when was the last time you said something interesting about how Russia must develop in a post-Putin future? When was the last time you said something interesting about how Russia can stop being an expansionist empire? When was the last time you said something constructive about how a future Russia builds its relationships with Europe? Because the majority of your messaging is just anti-war messaging, which is right, and the message that Ukraine must win the war, which is right. For Russia, that's right. So we can straight away start being mean about these folks, and that's the problem. That it's an act of self-discreditation, and it is going to be interpreted and has been universally interpreted as score settling, you know, because here is Navalny's team back then in Russia trying to do stuff, trying to shake the system, trying to get itself involved via protest or via organizing or via trying to, you know, get into political processes, trying to get into electoral processes. And there was Venediktov doing something unconstructive and dumb and perhaps unethical and wrong, while doing, for each wrong thing he did, 100 things right. And he got in your way, and now you don't like him. And is it true that even today, Venediktov's personal contact with some people in the regime, his capacity to text them, might leave you uncomfortable? Sure, but that's none of your business, because you're not a tribunal. You are there to do politics. So what's your job? Your job is to politicize Russia. Your job is to deactivate this extraordinary denial and passivity, which we're talking about, sadly now, I think, on Monday, because for health reasons I couldn't do much yesterday and today on that video. But we're going to be having a very comprehensive episode on the main channel about the extraordinary depoliticization of Russians that still continues every day. So what are you doing about that? What are your strategies? You know? So that's basically my answer to the question, what's your comment on this inclusion of Alexei Venediktov in that list? It's such a silly act that it's not even a political mistake. It's a kind of evasion of serious politics in exchange for something that is at best frivolous and at worst is a kind of act of score settling. And even though Venediktov, in response to them, has said some things that are speculative, that I don't necessarily feel I can support. For instance, that they've got somebody in their team who is working for the Kremlin and they're not properly aware of that. But short of all the things that Venediktov has said in response to them, that I don't necessarily endorse or understand, I can't evaluate, the first thing he said in response to them knocked them out completely cold. He said, this is small stuff, however you legislate on this, compared to the real stuff that we should be focusing on, which is that Ukrainians are being killed every day, and we've got to get this Russian invasion to stop straight away. And that this invasion is also ruining Russia's future. And over and above that, he said, do you know who is going to be repeatedly welcome on my new YouTube channel? Navalny's team, who have now tried to cancel me and make me stay, maybe make me confined to Russian territory, because that's what happened to me if it was on the sanctions list. And that's obviously highly embarrassing that he put it in the right context, and he is standing for a tradition of cooperation and free speech that he's always tried to lead on, and they are doing petty and toxic cancellation. So that's my answer. I'm not sure if that was sufficiently interesting, and I'm sorry if I've sort of stolen time from you with this ramble, but maybe to some of you it was of value. Talk very soon. Lots of love.